The first gunshot echoed across the dusty streets of Cottonwood Springs, Colorado, in the summer of 1878, just as Daisy Russell stumbled out of her stepfather's saloon with tears streaming down her face and a fresh bruise blooming on her cheek. At 20 years old, she'd endured Hank Russell's escalating cruelty since her mother's passing 3 years prior. But tonight something had changed in his eyes, something that had her running despite the late hour. Daisy's golden hair fell loose around her shoulders as she darted between buildings, her simple blue dress torn at the hem from catching on a nail. The moon illuminated the frontier town just enough for her to navigate without tripping, though her vision blurred with tears. Behind her, the saloon doors banged open, followed by Hank's slurred bellowing. "You get back here, girl. You ain't finished your work." His heavy boots thudded against the wooden boardwalk. "I'll teach you to embarrass me in front of paying customers." Daisy's heart hammered in her chest. She'd never seen him this angry, not even when she'd accidentally broken a bottle of his expensive whiskey last month. Tonight had been different. She'd rejected the advances of a wealthy cattle baron who'd offered Hank a substantial sum for private time with his stepdaughter. When she'd refused to go upstairs with the man, Hank had struck her hard enough to send her crashing into a table of poker players. She darted down an alley between the general store and the blacksmith shop, praying she could make it to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. The kind widow had offered her sanctuary once before, though Daisy hadn't taken it then. "There you are, you ungrateful little." Hank's voice was closer now as he cut through a side street, his bulky silhouette blocking her path forward. Daisy skidded to a halt, her breath catching painfully in her throat. In the moonlight, she could see the leather belt wrapped around his fist, the metal buckle gleaming dully. This wasn't going to be a simple slap or shove. Hank intended to truly hurt her this time. "Please," she whispered, backing away. "I'm sorry about the customer. I'll make it up to you somehow." "You're damn right you will." Hank advanced, reeking of whiskey and cigar smoke. His face, once handsome enough to charm her mother, was now bloated and red with drink and rage. "Your mama's been gone 3 years, and I've kept a roof over your head this whole time. This is how you repay me, by chasing away good money." Daisy bumped against the rough wooden wall of the general store. There was nowhere left to run. He tried to. I don't care what he wanted. Hank raised the belt. "You do as you're told in my establishment." Daisy closed her eyes, raising her arms to shield her face. But the blow never came. "That's far enough, Russell." The voice was deep and steady, cutting through the night air like a blade. Daisy's eyes flew open to see a tall figure step between her and Hank. In the shadowy alley, she could only make out his broad shoulders and the distinctive silhouette of a cowboy hat. But she recognized the voice immediately. Jackson Hayes, the quiet rancher who'd been coming into the saloon for the past few months. He always sat in the corner, nursed a single whiskey, and left a generous tip. Never caused trouble, never joined the rowdier patrons in their drunken carousing. "This ain't your business, Hayes." Hank's voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "This is between me and my stepdaughter. She works for me, lives under my roof, and she'll damn well do as she's told." Jackson didn't move an inch. "Looks to me like you're about to beat a young woman half your size with a belt. That makes it my business. She's mine to discipline." Hank took a lurching step forward, belt still raised. "Get out of my way." In one fluid motion, Jackson drew his revolver, the metal catching a glint of moonlight. He didn't point it at Hank, not yet, but held it at his side, a clear warning. "Miss Russell isn't property," Jackson said, his voice deceptively calm. "And she certainly isn't yours to hurt. Now, I suggest you turn around, head back to your saloon, and sleep off whatever's got into you tonight." Hank's face contorted with rage. "You threatening me over some worthless girl? He gestured wildly toward Daisy. "She's nothing but trouble, always has been." Jackson's stance shifted subtly, his body angling to better shield Daisy. "I'm not threatening anything. I'm simply stating facts. Miss Russell is leaving with me and you're going back to your saloon. Those are your choices." Hank's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "And if I choose differently?" That's when Jackson finally raised the revolver, pointing it steadily at the center of Hank's chest. "Then you'll touch her over my grave." The alley fell silent except for the distant piano music drifting from the saloon and the soft sound of Daisy's ragged breathing. For a moment she thought Hank might actually charge forward, belt swinging. His face twisted with conflicting emotions: rage, drunken confusion, and finally, a calculating coldness. "You're making a big mistake, Hayes," Hank finally spat. "This town knows me. I've been here 15 years. You're just some drifter who showed up months ago." Jackson didn't waver. "Maybe. But right now, I'm a drifter with a gun pointed at your chest. Your move." The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity before Hank let the belt slip from his fingers. It landed with a dull thud in the dirt. "This ain't over," he muttered, stepping back. "Not by a long shot." He jabbed a finger toward Daisy. "And you don't bother coming back for your things. Whatever you left behind is payment for all I've done for you." With that, he turned and staggered back toward the main street, occasionally steadying himself against the buildings as he went. Daisy released a shuddering breath, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. She slid down the wall until she was sitting in the dirt, arms wrapped around her knees. She dreamed of escaping Hank for years, but now that the moment had actually arrived, she felt nothing but terror. Where would she go? What would she do? She had no money, no possessions beyond the clothes she wore. Jackson holstered his weapon and knelt before her, keeping a respectful distance. In the moonlight, she could finally see his face clearly: the strong jaw covered in a few days' worth of stubble, the straight nose, and eyes so deeply blue they were almost black in the darkness. Concern etched lines around his eyes, making him look older than his 30 years. "Are you hurt, Miss Russell?" His voice was gentler now, all the steel gone from it. Daisy touched her cheek where Hank had struck her earlier. It was tender and would likely bruise, but she'd had worse. "Nothing serious." She hesitated, then added softly, "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. I was on my way home from the saloon when I heard the commotion." He offered her his hand. "Can you stand?" Daisy nodded and accepted his help, noticing the calluses on his palm as he carefully pulled her to her feet. He released her hand immediately once she was steady, maintaining a proper distance. "Where will you go?" he asked. The question sent a fresh wave of panic through her. I don't know. Maybe Mrs. Henderson would let me stay at the boarding house for a night, but I have no money to pay her." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I'll figure something out. I've been wanting to leave for a long time." Jackson studied her for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "I have a small ranch about 5 miles outside of town. There's a cabin on the property where my foreman used to stay before he moved on last month. It's yours if you want it." Daisy stared at him in shock. "Mr. Hayes, I couldn't possibly. It's sitting empty," he interrupted gently. "And it's far enough from town that Russell won't be likely to bother you there, at least until you decide what you want to do next." Suspicion crept into her mind. She'd seen too many supposedly generous offers from men turned sour. And what would you expect in return? A flicker of something hurt crossed his features before his expression smoothed again. "Nothing, Miss Russell. The cabin is yours for as long as you need it, no conditions attached. I'd offer you work if you want it. My housekeeper could use help with cooking and cleaning, but that's entirely your choice." Daisy searched his face for any hint of deception and found none. She'd always thought Jackson Hayes seemed different from the other men who frequented the saloon. He was quiet, respectful, and never joined in when the others made crude remarks about the girls who served drinks. Still, she'd learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. "Why would you help me?" she asked bluntly. Jackson adjusted his hat, looking momentarily uncomfortable. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be at someone else's mercy." He glanced back toward the main street where Hank had disappeared. "He'll be back once he sobers up, and he'll be even angrier. I don't think it's safe for you here tonight." Daisy knew he was right. And really, what choice did she have? The boarding house would only be a temporary solution, and she had no money for the stagecoach fare to Denver or any other larger town where she might find work. "All right," she said finally. "I accept your offer, Mr. Hayes. Thank you." He nodded once, relief briefly softening his features. "My horse is hitched outside the saloon. Stay here while I get him, then we'll ride out together." As Jackson disappeared around the corner, Daisy wrapped her arms around herself, trying to process the whirlwind of events. An hour ago, she'd been serving drinks and dodging wandering hands in the smoky saloon. Now, she was leaving the only home she'd known for the past 3 years to stay in a stranger's cabin. But Jackson Hayes wasn't entirely a stranger, she reminded herself. She'd observed him during his visits to the saloon, noted his quiet dignity and the way he always treated her with respect. And tonight, he'd put himself between her and Hank without hesitation. True to his word, Jackson returned minutes later leading a magnificent chestnut gelding. He helped Daisy mount first, then swung up behind her, maintaining as much proper distance as the saddle would allow. "Hold on to the pommel," he instructed quietly. "It's not a long ride, but some parts of the trail are rough." As they rode out of town under the vast canopy of stars, Daisy felt a curious mixture of terror and hope. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she had a chance to find out on her own terms. The ride to Jackson's ranch passed mostly in silence, broken only by his occasional directions to hold tight as they navigated a steep section of trail or crossed a shallow creek. Daisy was acutely aware of his presence behind her, the solid warmth of him, the careful way he kept his hands on the reins rather than touching her waist, even when the horse stumbled slightly. The night air grew cooler as they left the valley where Cottonwood Springs nestled and climbed into the rolling foothills. Daisy shivered in her thin dress, wishing she'd had the chance to grab her shawl from the hook by the saloon's back door. "We're nearly there," Jackson said, noticing her discomfort. Without further comment, he shifted slightly and draped his coat around her shoulders, the movement so smooth she barely had time to protest. "You'll catch cold," she objected. "I'm used to it." The simple statement carried no hint of complaint. Another 10 minutes of riding brought them to a clearing where the moonlight revealed a modest but well-maintained ranch house. A barn stood nearby, alongside a smaller structure that Daisy assumed must be the foreman's cabin Jackson had mentioned. He guided the horse to the cabin and dismounted first, then offered his hand to help her down. Daisy's legs felt wobbly after the long ride, and she clutched his arm momentarily to steady herself. "Thank you," she murmured, releasing him quickly. Jackson nodded and led her to the cabin door. He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked it, then stepped back to let her enter first. "I'll light the lamp." The cabin was small but surprisingly comfortable, a single room with a bed against one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a small cookstove, and a stone fireplace. Everything was neat and clean, with no sign of having been uninhabited for a month. Jackson lit the oil lamp on the table, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow. "Mrs. Tucker, my housekeeper, keeps it ready in case we hire a new foreman," he explained, seeing Daisy's surprise at the cabin's condition. "There's fresh bedding in the trunk, wood for the fire, and some basic provisions in the cupboard." He moved to the fireplace and began arranging kindling and logs. Daisy stood in the center of the room, still clutching his coat around her shoulders, feeling suddenly awkward. "You don't need to do that. I can manage." "It gets cold at night up here," he said, continuing his task. "Just let me get this started for you." Within minutes, a small fire was crackling in the hearth, lending additional warmth and light to the cabin. Jackson straightened and brushed his hands on his trousers. "The pump outside has good water," he said, gesturing toward the door. "There's a wash basin and soap on the shelf there. Mrs. Tucker left some of her daughter's old clothes in the trunk when she moved out to marry last year. They might not fit perfectly, but they'll be better than nothing until we can get your things from town." "My things," Daisy repeated softly. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. She had nothing, no clothes beyond what she wore, no personal possessions, not even a hairbrush. Jackson must have noticed her distress. "Don't worry about Russell. Once he's sobered up, I'll go back and talk to him about releasing your belongings." "You don't understand," Daisy said, sinking into one of the chairs. "He meant what he said. He won't let me have anything. He'll probably sell whatever I left behind or burn it out of spite." Jackson frowned. "That's not right. You worked for those things." Daisy gave a bitter laugh. "Right doesn't enter into it with Hank. He's been taking what he wants and doing as he pleases since he married my mother 6 years ago." She pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. "I should have left after she died, but I was 17 and scared, and he convinced me I couldn't survive on my own." Jackson remained standing, his expression troubled. 17 is plenty old enough to make your own way. Not when you've been told your whole life that you're worthless." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Daisy immediately regretted her candor. "I'm sorry. You've been more than kind, and I'm burdening you with my troubles. No need to apologize." He moved toward the door. "I should let you rest. It's been a long night for you." Daisy rose quickly, slipping off his coat and holding it out to him. "Thank you again, Mr. Hayes. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." He took the coat, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "There's nothing to repay. The door has a good strong lock, and I'm just up at the main house if you need anything." He hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Tucker will be by in the morning with breakfast. She'll help you get settled." With a slight nod, he stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. Daisy immediately slid the bolt into place, then stood with her back against the door, listening to his retreating footsteps. For the first time since fleeing the saloon, she was completely alone. The realization brought fresh tears to her eyes, not of fear this time, but of overwhelming relief. No Hank lurking around the corner, no drunken patrons to avoid, no constant tension of wondering when the next blow would fall. She moved to the trunk at the foot of the bed and opened it, finding neatly folded linens and beneath them, several simple dresses and undergarments. As Jackson had said, they might not fit perfectly, but they would serve until she could make other arrangements. After making up the bed with fresh sheets and a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender, Daisy retrieved the wash basin and ventured outside to fill it from the pump. The night was peaceful, with nothing but the distant hooting of an owl and the soft rustling of pine trees in the breeze. The main house sat dark and quiet some 100 yards away, with only a single lamp burning in what she assumed was Jackson's room. Back inside the cabin, she washed away the dirt and tears of the evening, wincing as she touched the tender spot on her cheek where Hank had struck her. It would be bruised by morning, she knew. She changed into a clean nightgown from the trunk, marveling at the feel of the soft cotton after years of making do with worn, often patched garments. As she climbed into bed, Exhaustion swept over her. But despite her weariness, sleep eluded her for a long time as her mind raced with questions about her uncertain future. What would she do now? How would she support herself? How long could she impose on Jackson Hayes's generosity? And most troubling of all, what would Hank do? When he realized she truly wasn't coming back, dawn broke with a gentle golden light filtering through the cabin's single window. Daisy woke disoriented, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings before the events of the previous night came rushing back. She sat up quickly, wincing at the soreness in muscles unused to horseback riding. The fire had died down to embers, and the cabin was chilly. Daisy wrapped the quilt around her shoulders and padded to the fireplace, adding a few small logs from the neatly stacked pile beside it. Once the fire was crackling again, she filled the kettle from the water bucket and set it on the stove to heat. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Miss Russell, it's Ethel Tucker from the main house." Daisy hastily smoothed her tangled hair and tightened the quilt around her shoulders before opening the door. A plump, gray-haired woman with kind eyes and rosy cheeks stood on the threshold, carrying a large covered basket. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Tucker said, her gaze briefly flickering to the bruise on Daisy's cheek before settling into a warm smile. "I've brought you some breakfast and a few other necessities. May I come in?" "Of course, Mrs. Tucker. Please." Daisy stepped back, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance and borrowed nightgown. "Now, none of that Mrs. Tucker business," the older woman said, bustling inside and setting the basket on the table. "You call me Ethel just like everyone else does." She began unpacking the basket, revealing a small loaf of fresh bread, a pot of preserves, a wedge of cheese, and a jar of cream. "The coffee's still in the cupboard from when Mr. Daniels, that was our last foreman, lived here. Should be perfectly fine." Daisy moved to help her. "This is very kind of you, Mrs. Ethel. You didn't need to trouble yourself." "Nonsense. We take care of our own here at the Hayes Ranch." Ethel paused in her unpacking to give Daisy a gentle pat on the arm. "Mr. Hayes told me a bit about your situation." "Not details. Mind you, he's not one for gossip. Just that you needed a safe place to stay for a while." Embarrassment heated Daisy's cheeks. What must this respectable woman think of her, fleeing in the night, bruised and desperate, as if reading her thoughts? Ethel's expression softened. "There's no shame in needing help, child. We all do at some point or another." She removed a final package from the basket, a small bundle wrapped in brown paper and string. "Some soap, a hairbrush, and a few other ladies' things you might need. My Sarah left them behind when she married and moved to Denver." "Thank you," Daisy said, touched by the thoughtfulness. "I'll pay you back as soon as I can find work." Ethel waved away the offer. "Consider them a welcome gift." She bustled over to check the kettle, which was starting to steam. "Now, why don't you get dressed and I'll fix us some coffee. Then we can discuss how you might like to spend your time here." Daisy retreated behind the privacy screen in the corner with one of the dresses from the trunk. It was a simple blue calico, slightly large in the bodice but otherwise a reasonable fit. When she emerged, Ethel had set the table with 2 cups of steaming coffee and was slicing the bread. "That color suits you," the housekeeper commented approvingly. "A little loose, perhaps, but nothing we can't fix with a needle and thread." They sat together, and Daisy gratefully accepted the offered bread and preserves. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first sweet bite hit her tongue. "Mr. Hayes mentioned you might be looking for work," Ethel said, stirring cream into her coffee. "As it happens, I could use an extra pair of hands at the main house. Nothing too strenuous, some cooking, cleaning, mending. Mr. Hayes is a bachelor, you know, so it's just him and the 2 ranch hands to look after, plus me when I'm here. You don't live on the property, Daisy asked. "I have a small place in town. I come out 3 days a week to cook meals ahead and do the heavier cleaning." Ethel smiled. "But I'm not as young as I once was, and having someone else here daily would ease my mind about Mr. Hayes. That man would survive on coffee and jerky if left to his own devices." Daisy couldn't help but return the smile. "I'd be happy to help in any way I can. I'm a decent cook, though nothing fancy, and I'm good with a needle." "Perfect. We'll start this morning if you're feeling up to it." Ethel's expression grew more serious. "Mr. Hayes rode into town at first light. He said he had business to attend to, but I suspect he's gone to have words with your stepfather." Daisy nearly choked on her coffee. "He shouldn't have. Hank can be dangerous when he's angry." "Mr. Hayes can handle himself," Ethel said with quiet confidence. "He was a lawman before he came here, you know, over in Wyoming territory." This was news to Daisy. She'd always assumed Jackson was simply a rancher. "I didn't know that. Why did he leave?" Ethel hesitated. "That's his story to tell if he chooses. All I know is he came here about 8 months ago, bought this land from old Mr. Peterson, who was moving to California, and has been working it ever since. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's a good man. Fair with his workers, generous to those in need." As they finished breakfast, Ethel outlined the daily tasks that needed attention at the main house. By the time they walked up the path together an hour later, Daisy felt more centered than she had in years. Having productive work to do and a safe place to sleep were luxuries she'd almost forgotten. The main house was larger than she'd estimated in the darkness the night before, a solid 2-story structure built of rough-hewn logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. The interior was simply but comfortably furnished, with a large kitchen, a dining room, a study lined with bookshelves, and a sitting room with well-worn leather chairs arranged near a stone fireplace. "Mr. Hayes's bedroom and a guest room are upstairs," Ethel explained as she showed Daisy around. "Though we've never had guests stay overnight that I know of." The morning passed quickly as Daisy helped with laundry, learned where everything was kept in the kitchen, and assisted in preparing a stew that would feed the men for several days. Around noon, they heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Ethel peered out the window. "That'll be Mr. Hayes returning." Daisy's stomach knotted with anxiety. Had he confronted Hank? What had happened? The front door opened and Jackson strode in, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. He looked tired, with a thin layer of dust covering his clothes, but otherwise unharmed. His eyes found Daisy immediately, softening slightly as he noted her presence in the kitchen. "Mrs. Tucker, Miss Russell." He nodded to each of them in turn. "You're just in time for dinner, Mr. Hayes," Ethel said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Miss Russell has been a tremendous help this morning. I'm glad to hear it." He hung his hat on a peg by the door and moved to wash his hands at the basin. "I'll need to ride out to check the north pasture after we eat. Johnson reported a section of fence down yesterday." Daisy couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. "Did you see my stepfather in town, Mr. Hayes?" Jackson turned, his expression carefully neutral. "I did." "And," she prompted when he didn't elaborate. He sighed, leaning against the kitchen counter. "He was sober, but not particularly reasonable. I offered to buy your belongings from him for a fair price. He refused." Daisy's heart sank, though she wasn't surprised. "I told you he would." "What he actually said isn't fit to repeat in mixed company," Jackson continued, a hint of anger creeping into his voice. "But the gist was that you're not welcome back in town, and if you return, he'll make sure everyone knows what kind of woman you are." What kind of? Daisy felt her cheeks flame with indignation. "I served drinks and cleaned tables. I know," Jackson cut her off gently. "Everyone in town knows. Russell can spread whatever lies he wants, but your reputation speaks for itself. Did he threaten you?" Daisy asked, suddenly worried about the consequences Jackson might face for helping her. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "He tried. I suggested he reconsider." Ethel clucked her tongue disapprovingly. "That man's been nothing but trouble since the day he arrived in Cottonwood Springs. Used to be just a drunk, but he's grown mean over the years." She began ladling stew into bowls. "Well, no matter. You're safe here, Miss Russell, and welcome to stay as long as you like." Jackson nodded in agreement. "The position helping Mrs. Tucker is yours for as long as you want it. Pay is $15 a month plus room and board." Daisy stared at him in shock. $15 was more than she'd ever earned at the saloon, where Hank had kept most of her earnings for room and board, despite making her work long hours. "That's very generous," she managed finally. "It's fair pay for honest work," he replied simply. "Nothing more, nothing less." Over the meal, Jackson outlined the boundaries of the ranch property, explaining which areas were safe for Daisy to explore on her own and which she should avoid due to rough terrain or the occasional mountain lion. He was businesslike but kind, treating her with the same respectful tone he used with Mrs. Tucker. When he'd finished eating, he rose from the table. "I should check that fence before sunset. Johnson and Martinez are out with the herd today, but they'll be back for supper. Mrs. Tucker can introduce you." After he'd gone, Ethel insisted Daisy rest while she cleaned up from the meal. "You've had quite an ordeal, dear. Take some time for yourself this afternoon. There are books in the study if you enjoy reading, or you're welcome to explore the garden out back." Daisy chose the garden, finding peace in the neat rows of vegetables and herbs bordered by wildflowers. She sat on a wooden bench beneath an apple tree, letting the sun warm her face as she tried to process everything that had happened. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps her life could be different, that she might find not just safety, but happiness as well. The following weeks settled into a comfortable routine. Daisy rose early each morning to help prepare breakfast for Jackson and the ranch hands, then spent her days cleaning, cooking, mending, and assisting Ethel with whatever needed doing. In the evenings, she often retreated to the cabin with a book borrowed from Jackson's surprisingly extensive library. Johnson and Martinez, the two permanent ranch hands, were respectful and friendly without being overly familiar. Both were married men with families in town whom they visited on their days off, and they treated Daisy with the same cordial courtesy they showed Mrs. Tucker. Jackson himself remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite and considerate, ensuring Daisy had everything she needed and occasionally asking if she was comfortable in the cabin. But he maintained a certain distance, often working from sunrise to sunset and taking his meals quickly before retreating to his study or riding out to check some distant part of the property. One evening about 3 weeks after her arrival, Daisy was returning a book to the study when she found Jackson seated at his desk, poring over account ledgers by lamplight. "I'm sorry," she said, pausing in the doorway. "I didn't mean to disturb you." He looked up, seeming almost surprised to see her. "You're not disturbing me. Come in." She entered hesitantly, holding out the book, a collection of poetry by Wordsworth that she'd been savoring over the past few days. "I just wanted to return this and perhaps borrow another if that's all right." "Of course." He set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair. "Did you enjoy it?" "Very much. His descriptions of nature are so vivid." She placed the book on the shelf and ran her fingers along the spines of the others. "You have quite a collection for a ranch house." "Books travel better than furniture," he said with a slight smile. "I brought most of them with me from Wyoming." Daisy selected another volume, a novel this time. Mrs. Tucker mentioned you were a lawman there." Something flickered in his eyes, a wariness that made her immediately regret bringing it up. "I was, for about 5 years. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry, you weren't." He rose from the desk and moved to stand near the bookshelves, though still maintaining a proper distance between them. "It's not a secret, just not something I discuss often." He nodded toward the book in her hands. "Jane Eyre, have you read it before?" "No, but I've heard it's wonderful." "It was my sister's favorite." A hint of sadness colored his voice. "She insisted I read it years ago. I suspect you'll enjoy it more than I did." It was the first time he'd mentioned having a sister, and Daisy was curious but didn't want to press him for details. "Thank you for letting me borrow your books. It's a kindness I didn't expect. Reading is a pleasure everyone should have access to." He moved back to his desk but remained standing. "How are you finding everything? Is the cabin comfortable enough?" "More than comfortable. It's the nicest place I've ever lived, to be honest." She clutched the book to her chest. "And the work with Mrs. Tucker suits me well. I can't thank you enough for all you've done." Jackson seemed almost uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You've earned your place here with good work." "There's no need for thanks." A moment of awkward silence stretched between them before Daisy spoke again. "Have you heard anything more from town? About my stepfather, I mean." Jackson's expression hardened slightly. "Nothing specific." "Johnson mentioned Russell was telling anyone who would listen that you'd run off with a man of ill repute, but most folks aren't paying him much mind. They've seen his true character over the years. Still, I'm sorry to have brought trouble to your doorstep." "You didn't bring it, Miss Russell. Trouble was already there in the form of your stepfather." He picked up his pencil again, a signal that the conversation was nearing its end. "If you ever need to go into town for any reason, I'd be happy to accompany you. But perhaps it's best to wait a few more weeks until Russell has found some new grievance to occupy him." "I have no desire to go back any time soon," Daisy assured him, "but thank you for the offer." As she turned to leave, Jackson called after her, "Miss Russell." She paused in the doorway. "Yes." "I'm glad you're here." The simple statement seemed to cost him some effort. "The house feels more alive with you in it." The unexpected compliment warmed her cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Good night." "Good night, Miss Russell." As summer gave way to early autumn, the days grew shorter and the nights cooler. Daisy found herself settling into life at the ranch with increasing contentment. Her work was satisfying, her little cabin cozy, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt truly safe. She also found herself watching Jackson more closely, noticing the way he always rose before dawn, how he would spend hours in the evening making detailed notes in his ledgers, the gentle way he handled his horses, and his unfailing fairness with Johnson and Martinez. There was a quietness about him that she had initially mistaken for aloofness, but now recognized as a thoughtful nature. One crisp September morning, Daisy was gathering eggs from the chicken coop when she heard the sound of approaching riders. Moving to the edge of the barn, she saw Jackson riding alongside another man she didn't recognize. As they drew closer, she realized with a start that the stranger was wearing a sheriff's badge. Her heart hammered in her chest. Had Hank convinced the law to come after her for some imagined offense? Jackson spotted her and raised a hand in greeting, his expression reassuring. "Miss Russell, good morning. This is Sheriff Thomas from Cottonwood Springs." The sheriff, a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper mustache, tipped his hat to her. "Miss Russell, no need to look alarmed. I'm just here to have a word with Hayes about some cattle business." Daisy nodded uncertainly, clutching the basket of eggs against her apron. "Of course. I'll bring coffee to the house if you'd like." "That would be most welcome," Jackson said, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post. "We won't be long." She hurried to the kitchen, setting the eggs aside and putting the coffee pot on to boil. Through the window, she watched the two men enter the house, their expressions serious. Whatever cattle business they were discussing, it didn't look pleasant. When the coffee was ready, Daisy arranged cups, cream, and sugar on a tray and carried it into the sitting room where the men had settled. She tried not to eavesdrop, but couldn't help overhearing fragments of their conversation as she approached. "Rustlers hit the Davidson place last night," the sheriff was saying. "Took nearly 20 head, same as the Peterson ranch last week." "Any tracks?" Jackson asked, his voice tense. Heading northwest toward, the sheriff broke off as he noticed Daisy entering with the tray. "Ah, thank you, Miss Russell." She set the tray on the table between them. "Will there be anything else, gentlemen?" "No, thank you," Jackson said, his tone polite but dismissive. Daisy retreated to the kitchen, her mind racing. Cattle rustlers operating in the area was serious business. Ranching was difficult enough without thieves stealing livestock. She busied herself with preparing lunch, trying not to worry about what this might mean for the safety of the ranch and for Jackson, if he decided to pursue the criminals. Nearly an hour later, she heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of a horse galloping away. A few moments after that, Jackson appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Everything all right?" she asked, attempting to sound casual as she kneaded bread dough. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. "There's been some trouble with rustlers in the area. Sheriff Thomas wanted to warn me to keep an eye out." "I couldn't help overhearing a bit," Daisy admitted. "It sounds serious." "It could be. Rustling's always been a problem out here, but this seems more organized than usual." He rubbed a hand over his jaw, where a day's worth of stubble had accumulated. "I'm going to ride the boundaries this afternoon with Johnson and Martinez. We'll set up a watch rotation starting tonight." Concern flared in Daisy's chest. "Is that safe?" "If these men are as dangerous as they sound, we'll be careful," he assured her. "But I can't afford to lose any cattle. The herd isn't large to begin with." A shadow crossed his face. "This ranch is everything I have." The vulnerability in his voice touched something in Daisy. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved closer to him. "Is there anything I can do to help?" He seemed surprised by the offer. "Just be extra vigilant. Keep the doors locked, especially at night. And if you see or hear anything unusual, fire this." He reached into his pocket and produced a small revolver. "Do you know how to use one?" Daisy nodded slowly. Her father, before he died when she was 12, had taught her basic shooting. "Yes, though it's been some years. It's already loaded. One shot will bring whoever's on watch running." He held it out to her, handle first. "I hope you won't need it, but I'd feel better knowing you have it." She took the weapon carefully, feeling its weight in her palm. "Thank you. I'll be careful with it." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and neither pulled away immediately. For a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, a current of awareness that made Daisy's breath catch in her throat. Jackson was the first to step back, clearing his throat slightly. "I should get ready to ride out. The men will be waiting." "Of course." Daisy set the revolver on the counter, safely out of the way but within reach. "I'll pack some food for you to take." He nodded gratefully. "We'll likely be back after dark. Don't wait up." True to his word, Jackson and the ranch hands didn't return until well after sunset. Daisy had left a cold supper for them in the kitchen and retreated to her cabin, though she found herself unable to sleep, listening for the men's return and worrying about the danger they might face from the rustlers. The next few days fell into a tense pattern. The men took turns keeping watch at night while still attending to the regular ranch work during the day. Daisy could see the strain taking its toll on all of them, especially Jackson, who seemed to hardly sleep at all. On the fourth night, She was awakened just after midnight by the sound of a single gunshot. Heart pounding, she threw on her shawl over her nightgown, grabbed the revolver Jackson had given her, and hurried toward the main house. The yard was lit by the full moon, casting long shadows across the ground. She could see movement near the corral, several figures on horseback. More shots rang out, and she ducked behind a water trough, trying to make sense of the chaos. Jackson's voice carried across the yard. "Martinez, circle around. Johnson, cover the gate." Daisy peered over the trough and saw 3 unfamiliar riders attempting to drive a small group of cattle through the broken corral fence. Jackson and his men were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of knowing the terrain. One of the rustlers spotted her and raised his gun. Without thinking, Daisy fired the revolver. Her shot went wide, but it was enough to startle the man's horse, which reared suddenly, throwing its rider to the ground. The distraction gave Jackson the opportunity he needed. He charged forward on his horse, firing twice more. One of the remaining rustlers fell from his saddle while the other turned to flee, abandoning both his comrade and their stolen cattle. "Miss Russell, get back to the cabin," Jackson shouted, spotting her by the trough. She didn't need to be told twice. As Martinez and Johnson secured the fallen rustlers, Daisy ran back to her cabin, her heart hammering in her chest. She bolted the door and sank onto the edge of her bed, the revolver still clutched in her trembling hand. It seemed like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes before a knock came at her door. "Miss Russell, it's Hayes. Are you all right?" She hurried to unlock the door. Jackson stood on the threshold, a cut above his eye slowly seeping blood but otherwise appearing unharmed. "I'm fine," she said, stepping back to let him enter. "What happened? Is everyone safe?" Johnson took a bullet in the arm, but it's just a graze. Martinez is seeing to him. Jackson removed his hat, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "We caught 2 of the rustlers. Sheriff Thomas is on his way to collect them. And the 3rd got away. But he won't get far. I recognized him, one of Russell's regular poker players from the saloon." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "Makes me wonder if your stepfather might be involved somehow." Daisy sank into a chair, still shaking slightly from the encounter. "It wouldn't surprise me. Hank has always skirted the edges of the law." Jackson noticed her trembling and immediately looked concerned. "You're in shock. Let me build up your fire." Before she could protest, he was kneeling at the hearth, adding logs to the dying embers and coaxing them back to life. The domestic gesture from this usually reserved man struck Daisy as oddly touching. "Thank you for what you did out there," he said without looking up from his task. "That shot of yours created just the diversion we needed." "I was aiming for him," Daisy admitted. "I missed completely." A rare smile curved Jackson's lips as he turned toward her. "Sometimes a miss works just as well as a hit." The firelight caught the blood still trickling from the cut above his eye, drawing Daisy's attention. "You're hurt." She rose and fetched her wash basin and a clean cloth. "Let me help you with that." He started to refuse but seemed to think better of it. "Thank you." Daisy wet the cloth and gently began cleaning the cut. Standing this close to him, she was acutely aware of his presence, the warmth radiating from his body, the clean scent of his skin beneath the dust and sweat of the confrontation, the steady rhythm of his breathing. His eyes watched her face as she worked, their usual reserve softened by something she couldn't quite name. "It doesn't look too deep," she said softly, focusing on the task to steady her suddenly uneven breathing. "But head wounds always bleed more than they should." "I've had worse," he replied, his voice equally quiet. When she finished cleaning the cut, their eyes met, and Daisy felt a jolt of awareness that she couldn't ignore. There was something in Jackson's gaze, a hunger carefully restrained, a longing that matched the one growing in her own heart over these past weeks. For a moment, she thought he might lean forward, might close the distance between them. Instead, he gently captured her hand, lowering it from his face. "Thank you," he said again, his thumb brushing once across her knuckles before he released her. "I should get back to the house. The sheriff will be here soon and there's much to do before morning." Daisy nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course." He rose and moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Lock this behind me. I don't think there's any further danger tonight, but I'd feel better knowing you're secure." "I will." He nodded once and slipped out into the night. Daisy locked the door as promised, then leaned her forehead against the cool wood, trying to make sense of her confused emotions. She had come to care for Jackson Hayes far more than was wise for a woman in her position. He was her employer, her protector, the man who had rescued her from a desperate situation. Gratitude was natural, even expected, but what she felt went beyond gratitude into territory that both thrilled and terrified her. The following day brought the sheriff back to the ranch, this time with a deputy in tow to transport the captured rustlers to the jail in Cottonwood Springs. Daisy kept her distance, busying herself with chores in the kitchen while the men discussed the previous night's events. She was kneading bread dough when Jackson entered the kitchen, looking tired but satisfied. "Sheriff's taking the rustlers in," he reported, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "Both of them confirmed my suspicion they're associates of your stepfather. They claim he wasn't directly involved in the rustling, but he's been fencing the stolen cattle through a contact in Denver." Daisy's hands stilled in the dough. "Will they arrest Hank?" "The sheriff's going to question him, but without more evidence, it might be difficult to make charges stick." Jackson leaned against the counter, studying her. "Russell is well connected in town, unfortunately. He's been careful to keep his own hands clean." "That sounds like him." Daisy resumed her kneading, pressing perhaps harder than necessary. "He's always been skilled at making others do his dirty work." Jackson sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "The sheriff did mention something else you should know. Russell's been telling people he intends to file charges against me for kidnapping his stepdaughter." Daisy's head snapped up. "That's ridiculous." "I left willingly, more than willingly. You and I know that, but Russell is spinning quite a different tale." Jackson's voice remained calm, though she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "The sheriff doesn't believe him, especially after learning about the rustling connection. But it might be wise for you to make a formal statement that you left of your own accord." "Of course I will." Anger rose in her chest at the thought of Hank trying to cause trouble for the man who had helped her. "Does the sheriff want me to come to town?" "No need for that just yet. He'll send word if it becomes necessary." Jackson finished his coffee and set the cup aside. "In the meantime, I've asked Johnson and Martinez to keep extra watch around the property. I wouldn't put it past Russell to try something directly, now that his rustling operation has been disrupted." Concern replaced Daisy's anger. "Do you really think he would come here?" "I don't know. But I'd rather be prepared." His expression softened slightly. "Try not to worry. You're safe here." Over the next few days, life at the ranch gradually returned to normal. Johnson's arm healed quickly, and without further incidents, the tense atmosphere began to ease. Daisy fell back into her routine of cooking, cleaning, and assisting Mrs. Tucker, though she couldn't help noticing that Jackson seemed to be finding more reasons to be near the house than before. He took his meals more slowly, often lingering at the table to ask about her day or comment on a book she was reading. Sometimes in the evenings, she would find him on the porch, and he would invite her to sit with him, watching the sunset and talking of small, everyday matters. The distance he had maintained during her first weeks at the ranch was gradually diminishing, replaced by a careful friendship that Daisy cherished even as she longed for something more. One crisp October afternoon, she was gathering the last of the season's apples from the tree behind the house when Jackson approached, leading his saddled horse. "Miss Russell," he called, "I need to ride into town for supplies. I was wondering if you'd care to accompany me." Daisy hesitated, remembering his warning about her stepfather's threats. "Is it safe? Sheriff Thomas sent word this morning. Russell left town 3 days ago, apparently headed for Denver, something about a business opportunity." Jackson's mouth curved into a small smile. "I thought you might welcome a chance to visit the general store, perhaps purchase some fabric or other items you've been needing." The thought of new fabric was indeed tempting, though Mrs. Tucker had generously shared her daughter's old clothes. Daisy had been wanting to make a few things of her own choosing. "I would like that," she said finally, "but I haven't any money yet. You've been keeping my wages for me as we agreed, and they're yours whenever you wish to use them." Jackson reached into his pocket and produced a small envelope. "Here's what you've earned these past 6 weeks. You're welcome to spend as much or as little as you choose." Daisy took the envelope, surprised by its weight. "Thank you. I'll just need a few minutes to change into something more suitable for town." Half an hour later, they were riding together toward Cottonwood Springs, Daisy seated on a gentle mare that Jackson kept for occasional use. The day was perfect for riding, sunny but cool, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and distant snow from the mountains. "I never thanked you properly," Daisy said after they had ridden in comfortable silence for a while. "Not just for taking me in that night, but for everything since." "You've been more than generous." Jackson glanced over at her, his expression thoughtful. "You don't need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most men would have either left me to my fate or expected something in return for their help." He frowned at that. "Then most men are poorer specimens than I realized. Why did you help me? Truly." The question had been on her mind for weeks. "You hardly knew me." Jackson was silent for so long that Daisy thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "I had a sister once, Rebecca. She married young to a man who seemed kind and charming during their courtship, but once they were wed he changed, became controlling, then cruel." His hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. "I was working as a deputy in another town at the time. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late." A chill ran down Daisy's spine. "What happened?" "She died," he said simply. "He claimed it was an accident, that she fell down the stairs, but I knew better." The muscle in his jaw tightened. "I couldn't prove it, though. Not enough for the law. When I confronted him, things escalated. I nearly killed him with my bare hands. Would have if others hadn't pulled me off." "Oh, Jackson," Daisy breathed, forgetting formality in the face of his grief. "I resigned my badge after that. Couldn't bring myself to uphold a law that had failed my sister so completely." He looked over at her, his eyes haunted but clear. "So when I saw Russell raise that belt to you that night, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Not again." Daisy felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm so sorry about your sister, and grateful that you were there for me." He nodded once, then deliberately lightened his tone. "Enough of old sorrows. Today is too fine for dwelling on the past." As they rode into town, Daisy felt a curious mixture of anxiety and excitement. She hadn't been to Cottonwood Springs since fleeing the saloon that night in July, and she wasn't sure what reception to expect. Would people believe Hank's lies about her? Or would they understand why she had left? They tied their horses in front of the general store, and Jackson offered his arm to help her down. The gesture was proper and gentlemanly, but Daisy couldn't help noticing the lingering warmth of his hand at her elbow as they walked toward the store entrance. Inside, Mr. Peterson, the storekeeper, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Hayes, good to see you, and Miss Russell, we've been wondering how you've been getting along." His friendly welcome eased some of Daisy's tension. "Very well, thank you, Mr. Peterson. Glad to hear it. You let me know if there's anything special you're looking for today." He turned to Jackson. "Your order from last month arrived yesterday, Mr. Hayes. I'll have my boy loaded in your wagon." While Jackson discussed his supply needs with the storekeeper, Daisy wandered through the store, savoring the simple pleasure of being able to choose items for herself. She selected a length of soft blue cotton for a new dress, some ribbons, thread, and a few other necessities. She was examining a display of bonnets when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Well, if it isn't Daisy Russell, bold as brass. She turned to find Mabel Winters, one of the saloon girls who had worked alongside her at Hank's establishment. The woman was elaborately dressed, her dark hair piled high beneath an ostentatious feathered hat. "Hello, Mabel," Daisy said cautiously. "How are you?" "Better than I expected to find you." Mabel's eyes narrowed as she took in Daisy's simple but clean dress and healthy appearance. "When Hank said you'd run off with that quiet rancher, I figured you'd be used up and tossed aside by now. But look at you, all respectable and shopping like a proper lady." Heat rose in Daisy's cheeks. "It wasn't like that. Mr. Hayes offered me employment as a housekeeper, nothing more." Mabel raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Is that what they're calling it these days? Well, whatever arrangement you've made seems to be working for you." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Just watch yourself. Men like that, the quiet, brooding type, they're the ones who surprise you in the end." "Mr. Hayes has been nothing but respectful and kind," Daisy insisted, keeping her voice steady despite her rising anger. "Unlike some others I could name. If you say so, honey." Mabel's gaze flickered over Daisy's shoulder, and her expression changed subtly. "Speaking of your benefactor, here he comes now. I'll leave you to your shopping." With a rustle of silk skirts, she moved away just as Jackson approached. "Everything all right?" he asked, his eyes following Mabel's retreat. "Fine," Daisy said, trying to shake off the unsettling encounter. "Just someone I used to work with at the saloon." Jackson studied her face. "She upset you. She just repeated some of the things my stepfather has been saying about us." Daisy busied herself straightening the items she'd gathered. "It doesn't matter. It matters if it troubles you." His voice was gentle but firm. "What exactly has Russell been saying?" Daisy couldn't meet his eyes. That there's an improper arrangement between us." Understanding dawned in Jackson's expression, followed by a flash of anger. "I see." "I told her it wasn't true," Daisy added quickly. "That I'm employed as your housekeeper, nothing more. And so you are." He was silent for a moment, then said carefully, "Though I can see how your sudden departure from town, followed by taking up residence on my property, might have given rise to such assumptions. I never considered how it might appear," Daisy admitted. "I was just so grateful to be away from Hank." Jackson's expression softened. "You have nothing to apologize for, Miss Russell. People will talk regardless of what we do or don't do. The truth is known to us, and that's what matters." But as they finished their shopping and prepared to return to the ranch, Daisy couldn't help wondering if the rumors might be affecting Jackson's reputation as well as her own. He was respected in the community as a fair employer and honest businessman. Did people now look at him differently because of her presence in his household? The ride home was quieter than their journey into town had been. Daisy was lost in thought, troubled by Mabel's insinuations and the realization that her situation at the ranch might be more complicated than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. They were about halfway back when Jackson suddenly reined in his horse, his posture alert. "What's wrong?" Daisy asked, pulling her mare to a stop beside him. "Smoke," he said tersely, pointing toward the hills where his ranch lay. "Too much smoke for a cooking fire or normal chimney smoke." Daisy squinted in the direction he indicated and saw it to a dark column rising above the trees. Fear clutched at her heart. "The ranch? I'm afraid so." Jackson's face was grim. "Can you ride fast?" "Yes." "Then stay close." He urged his horse into a gallop, and Daisy followed, clutching her mare's mane as they raced toward the ominous smoke signal. As they crested the final hill, the devastating scene came into full view. The small foreman's cabin, Daisy's home for the past 2 months, was engulfed in flames, the fire having already consumed most of the structure. Johnson and Martinez were working frantically with buckets of water, trying to prevent the fire from spreading to the nearby barn, but it was clear the cabin itself was beyond saving. Jackson leapt from his horse before it had fully stopped, shouting to his men. "What happened?" Martinez ran to meet him, his face streaked with soot. "Riders, boss, 3 of them. They came fast, threw something through the window of the cabin, and it went up like tinder. We were checking the north fence line when we saw the smoke." "Did you recognize any of them?" Jackson demanded. Martinez shook his head. "They wore bandanas over their faces, but one of them was a big man on a dappled gray horse." Daisy felt her blood run cold. "Hank has a dappled gray, his pride and joy." Jackson's expression hardened. "I thought he was supposed to be in Denver." "Either he never left or he came back," Daisy said, dismounting shakily. "This is my fault. He's targeting you because of me." "This is not your fault," Jackson said firmly. "This is the act of a vindictive man who can't stand to lose control." He turned back to Martinez. "Is the main house secure?" "Johnson's checking it now. Doesn't look like they went near it." Over the next hour, they worked to fully extinguish the cabin fire and secure the rest of the property. By sunset, all that remained of Daisy's little home was a charred skeleton of blackened timber and ash. Everything inside, the clothes she had been given, the few personal items she had acquired, even the books Jackson had lent her, was destroyed. She stood staring at the smoldering ruins, a profound sense of loss washing over her. It wasn't just the material possessions, meager as they were. It was the sense of safety and independence the cabin had represented, her first real home since her mother died. "I'm sorry about your things," Jackson said, coming to stand beside her as the last light faded from the sky. "Especially the books. I know how much you enjoyed them." "They were only things," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What matters is that no one was hurt." He nodded, his expression troubled. "This changes things, though. Russell has escalated from threats to actual violence. I can't leave you unprotected in case he returns." "What do you suggest?" "For tonight, you'll have to stay in the main house. I'll sleep in the study and you can take my room upstairs." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Daisy had come to recognize as a sign of his concern. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out something more permanent. Perhaps Mrs. Tucker would be willing to stay here full-time for a while." Daisy felt a pang of guilt at the thought of further disrupting the household. "I could go to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house in town, or perhaps look for work in Denver, put some real distance between myself and Hank." "Is that what you want?" Jackson asked, his voice carefully neutral. "To leave?" She met his eyes in the gathering darkness. "No," she admitted softly, "but I won't be the cause of more trouble for you and your men. You've already done more than I had any right to expect." "Daisy." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it on his lips sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. "I don't want you to go, but I need you to be safe." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Before she could respond, Johnson approached from the direction of the barn. "Boss, I've checked all the buildings. Everything else seems untouched, but I found this nailed to the barn door." He held out a crumpled piece of paper. Jackson took it, moving closer to the lantern Martinez had hung from a post. His expression darkened as he read the crude message scrawled across the page. "What does it say?" Daisy asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Jackson hesitated, then handed her the note. The message was brief but chilling. This was just a warning. "The girl comes back or the next fire won't be so small. HR." Daisy's hand trembled as she read her stepfather's initials. "He's not going to stop, is he?" "Not willingly." Jackson took the note back and folded it carefully. "But neither am I." He turned to Johnson. "Ride into town first thing tomorrow and bring this to Sheriff Thomas. Tell him what happened here today and that I'll be in later to make a formal complaint." "Yes, sir," Johnson nodded. "What about tonight? Should we set a watch?" "I'll take the first shift," Jackson decided. "Martinez, you relieve me at midnight. Johnson, you'll take over at 4 until dawn." He glanced at Daisy. "Let's get you settled in the house. It's been a long day." Once inside, Jackson showed Daisy to his room, a simply furnished but comfortable space with a large bed, a chest of drawers, and a window overlooking the ranch yard. A bookshelf held more volumes, and a writing desk sat beneath the window. "There are extra linens in the chest at the foot of the bed," he said, standing in the doorway. "The room hasn't been used much lately. Mrs. Tucker usually only cleans up here once a week." "It's perfect," Daisy assured him, though she felt strange about taking his personal space. "Are you sure you'll be comfortable in the study? The sofa there is where I fall asleep half the time anyway," he said with a faint smile. "I'll be fine." He seemed reluctant to leave, lingering in the doorway even after showing her where everything was. Finally, he said, "Daisy, about what Russell wrote in that note. I won't let him take you back. I hope you know that." "I do." She moved closer to him, summoning her courage. "Jackson, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." He nodded, his expression serious. "Always. These past 2 months, you've given me work, shelter, protection. Everything I needed to start a new life. But I need to know, is it only because of what happened to your sister? Is your kindness to me just atonement for not being able to save her?" The question clearly caught him off guard. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and earnest. "Rebecca's story may have been why I stepped in that night in the alley, but it's not why I've wanted you to stay." He took a deep breath. "The truth is, I've come to care for you, Daisy. More than I should, perhaps, given our circumstances, but I've been careful not to let my feelings influence your choices. Your independence is too important." Daisy's heart quickened at his words. "And if my choice is to stay, not out of necessity or gratitude, but because I care for you too," the restraint in his eyes wavered. "Is that truly what you want?" "Yes," she whispered. "It has been for some time now." For a moment, she thought he might step forward, might finally bridge the careful distance he'd maintained between them for months. Instead, he gripped the door frame, his knuckles whitening with the effort of his restraint. "There are things we need to resolve first," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your stepfather's threats, the rumors in town. I won't have people saying I took advantage of your vulnerable position." "You haven't," she insisted. "I know that, and you know that. But others might see it differently." His expression softened. "I'm not rejecting what you're offering, Daisy. I'm just asking for a little more time to do this properly." Though disappointed, she understood his reasoning. Jackson was an honorable man. It was one of the qualities that had drawn her to him. "All right, time it is then," he smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Thank you. Now try to get some rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." After he left, Daisy sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the simple quilt. Despite the dangers still posed by her stepfather, despite the loss of her little cabin and its contents, she felt strangely at peace. Jackson cared for her, not out of pity or obligation, but genuinely. And she had finally found the courage to acknowledge her own feelings for him. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The following morning, Johnson rode into town with the threatening note while Jackson and Martinez took stock of the damage to the cabin and strengthened the ranch's defenses. Daisy threw herself into cooking and cleaning, needing the physical activity to keep her mind from dwelling too much on her stepfather's violent message. Mrs. Tucker arrived mid-morning, having heard about the fire from Johnson as he passed through town. She immediately took charge of the household arrangements, insisting that Daisy should continue to stay in the main house rather than return to town. "It's the sensible solution," the older woman declared as she kneaded bread dough with vigor. "You're safer here with Mr. Hayes and the men than you would be at the boarding house. And this way, I can return to town each evening to my own home, knowing you're here to look after things." "But the rumors," Daisy protested weakly. "People are already talking about my living on Mr. Hayes's property." Mrs. Tucker snorted. "People will talk regardless. Better they gossip while you're safe than while you're in danger." She eyed Daisy shrewdly. "Besides, it's plain to anyone with eyes that there's a genuine attachment between you and Mr. Hayes. Nothing improper about that." Daisy felt her cheeks warm. "We've only just begun to acknowledge it ourselves." "Sometimes the people involved are the last to know what everyone else can see," Mrs. Tucker said with a smile. "Mr. Hayes is an honorable man. He won't act on his feelings until he's sure it's proper to do so. But that doesn't mean those feelings aren't obvious to others." Before Daisy could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching. Moving to the window, she saw Jackson riding in alongside Sheriff Thomas and a deputy. "The sheriff's here," she said, wiping flour from her hands. "I should speak with him about what happened." Mrs. Tucker nodded approvingly. "Stand your ground, dear. That stepfather of yours has gotten away with far too much for far too long." Outside, Jackson was dismounting, his expression grim as he spoke with the sheriff. When he saw Daisy emerge from the house, he beckoned her over. "Miss Russell," Sheriff Thomas greeted her, tipping his hat. "Sorry to hear about the trouble yesterday. Mr. Hayes has filled me in on what happened and Johnson brought us the note. I need to ask you a few questions if you don't mind." "Of course, Sheriff." Daisy straightened her shoulders. "Whatever you need to know." They moved to the porch, where Daisy recounted everything she knew about the previous day's events, as well as her history with Hank Russell and his threats against both her and Jackson. The sheriff listened carefully, occasionally making notes in a small book he carried. "And you're certain the handwriting on the note is your stepfather's?" he asked. "As certain as I can be," Daisy confirmed. "I've seen his writing many times over the years." "And the initials HR for Hank Russell leave little doubt." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "We'll need to find him to question him, of course, but he seems to have left town again after the incident here. None of his usual associates have seen him since yesterday morning." "What about the men who were with him?" Jackson asked. "Martinez said there were 3 riders. Working on that too, got some suspicions based on who Russell normally runs with." Sheriff Thomas tucked his notebook away. "In the meantime, I'd advise you to keep up your guard here. Russell's clearly escalated from threats to action, and there's no telling what he might do next." "Is there nothing more that can be done?" Daisy asked, frustration evident in her voice. "Must we simply wait for him to attack again?" The sheriff looked sympathetic but shrugged slightly. "Law works slow sometimes, Miss Russell. Without Russell in custody to question, or witnesses who can place him definitely at the scene. We're working on circumstantial evidence." After the sheriff and his deputy departed, promising to send word if they located Hank, Jackson joined Daisy on the porch. He looked tired, the strain of the past day evident in the set of his shoulders. "I'm sorry the sheriff couldn't offer more immediate help," he said, leaning against the porch railing. "It's not your fault." Daisy moved to stand beside him, looking out over the ranch yard where Martinez was reinforcing the corral gate. "I knew Hank wouldn't let me go easily. I just never expected he would go this far. Men like Russell don't handle loss of control well." Jackson's voice held a hard edge, especially when it's control over another person. They stood in silence for a moment before Daisy spoke again. "Mrs. Tucker thinks I should continue to stay in the main house. For safety." Jackson nodded. "I agree, at least until Russell is found and dealt with." "But the talk in town, let them talk," he interrupted firmly. "Your safety is more important than gossip." His protectiveness warmed her, even as she worried about the complications their situation presented. "What about your reputation? You've worked hard to establish yourself here. I don't want to be the cause of people thinking poorly of you." Jackson turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Daisy, I meant what I said last night. I care for you deeply. If I were a different sort of man, I might have already asked for your hand, propriety be damned. But I want to do right by you, which means resolving this situation with your stepfather first, and ensuring that when we do move forward, it's because it's truly what you want, not because circumstances forced you into it." "It is what I want," she said softly. "I've never been more certain of anything." He reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. It was the first deliberate touch he had initiated between them that wasn't strictly necessary. "Then we'll find a way forward, together." The intimacy of the moment was interrupted by the sound of Mrs. Tucker clearing her throat from the doorway. "Dinner's nearly ready," she announced, though her eyes twinkled with approval at the sight of their clasped hands. "And I've made up the guest room for Miss Russell. Thought it might be more comfortable than having her in your room, Mr. Hayes." Jackson released Daisy's hand, a faint flush coloring his cheeks. "Thank you, Mrs. Tucker. That's very thoughtful." The older woman nodded, satisfied, and returned to the kitchen. Daisy couldn't help but laugh softly at Jackson's evident embarrassment. "She means well," she said. "And she's right, the guest room is probably more appropriate." "Definitely more appropriate," he agreed, though the reluctance in his voice sent a pleasant shiver through Daisy. "We should go in. Johnson and Martinez will be hungry after the morning's work." The next few days settled into a cautious routine. Daisy continued her duties around the house, now working alongside Mrs. Tucker during the day and remaining in the guest room at night. Jackson and the men maintained regular patrols of the property, especially after dark, and kept their weapons close at hand. There was no further sign of Hank or his associates, nor any word from the sheriff about their whereabouts. The lack of news was both a relief and a constant source of tension. Each day without incident allowed them to breathe a little easier. But the knowledge that Hank was still out there, potentially planning his next move, kept them all on edge. Despite the circumstances, Daisy found herself growing closer to Jackson. Their conversations over meals or during quiet evenings by the fire became more personal, more open. He told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, his years as a lawman in Wyoming, and his dream of building something permanent with the ranch. She shared stories of her mother, her early years traveling with her father before his death, and her hopes for a future that had seemed impossible while living under Hank's control. 5 days after the cabin fire, a letter arrived from the sheriff. Johnson brought it back from town along with the usual supplies, handing it to Jackson with a concerned expression. "Sheriff said to give you this right away, boss. Sounds important." Jackson read the letter quickly, his face darkening as he did. "Russell's been spotted in Denver," he reported. "Apparently trying to sell a large number of cattle to a butcher there. The sheriff thinks they might be from the Davidson and Peterson rustling jobs." "Is he being arrested?" Daisy asked hopefully. "Denver authorities are looking for him, but he disappeared before they could question him about the cattle." Jackson folded the letter carefully. "The sheriff thinks he might be heading back this way. He's warning us to stay alert." That evening, after Mrs. Tucker had departed for town and the men had eaten their supper, Jackson asked Daisy to join him in the study. He closed the door behind her, an unusual action that immediately alerted her that something serious was on his mind. "What is it?" she asked, taking a seat in one of the leather chairs by the fireplace. "You've been preoccupied all evening." Jackson remained standing, his tall frame silhouetted against the firelight. "I've been thinking about Russell and this ongoing threat. I believe I have a solution, but I'm not sure you'll like it." "Tell me," she said, both curious and apprehensive. He took a deep breath. "Marry me." Of all the things she had expected him to say, this was perhaps the last. "What?" "Hear me out," he said, moving to kneel beside her chair so they were eye to eye. "As your husband, I would have legal authority that I don't have as merely your employer. Russell would have no claim on you whatsoever, not your person, not your possessions, not even the right to speak to you without my permission." Daisy stared at him, trying to process his words. "You want to marry me, as a legal protection." Jackson's expression softened, and he took her hands in his. "No, Daisy. I want to marry you because I love you. I have for some time now. But I was willing to wait until Russell was no longer a threat, until we could court properly without the shadow of danger hanging over us." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms. "What I'm proposing now is that we don't wait, that we formalize what's already in our hearts, and in doing so, remove Russell's ability to threaten you legally." Love. He had said he loved her. The word echoed in Daisy's mind, drowning out all other considerations for a moment. "You love me." "More than I thought possible," he admitted, a vulnerability in his eyes she'd rarely seen. "I think I began falling in love with you that first night in the saloon, months before I stepped between you and Russell in that alley. You had such quiet dignity, even in those surroundings. Such kindness, even to the most difficult customers." Tears pricked at Daisy's eyes. "I love you too, Jackson, but marriage is. It's not something to enter into lightly, even for the best of reasons." "I know." He squeezed her hands gently. "And if you need more time, I understand, but I want you to know that this isn't just about protecting you from Russell. It's about building a life together, the life I think we both want." Daisy searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity and love in his steady gaze. "Yes," she whispered finally. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jackson Hayes. Not because of Hank or legal protections, but because I love you and want to share my life with yours." The smile that broke across his face was like sunshine after a storm, radiant and full of promise. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, almost reverent, but it held all the passion and tenderness she had imagined in her most private thoughts. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Jackson pressed his forehead to hers. "I'll ride into town tomorrow to speak with the minister." "How soon would you like to have the ceremony?" "As soon as possible," Daisy said, surprising herself with her certainty. "I don't need anything elaborate. Just you and me and perhaps Mrs. Tucker and the men as witnesses." "What about a dress? Don't all young women dream of a special wedding gown?" Daisy laughed softly. My dreams have changed. Now they are about a home and a future with someone I love. The dress seems considerably less important." Jackson kissed her again, more boldly this time. "Nevertheless, we'll ask Mrs. Tucker to help you find something suitable. I want this to be a day you remember with joy, not one rushed through because of circumstances." The following day, Jackson rode into town as planned to speak with Reverend Thompson about performing the ceremony. Daisy spent the morning with Mrs. Tucker, who was delighted by the news and immediately set about helping her prepare. "I knew this day would come," the older woman said as she examined the fabric Daisy had purchased on their last trip to town. "Not quite enough here for a proper wedding dress, but I have some cream-colored silk at home that would complement it beautifully. We could fashion something quite lovely between the two." Daisy was touched by her enthusiasm. "You don't think it's too sudden, or that people will assume that you're marrying because you have to?" Mrs. Tucker snorted. "Anyone who's seen you two together knows better, and as for sudden, well, when it's right, it's right. My Harold proposed after knowing me just 6 weeks, and we had 42 wonderful years together before he passed." By mid-afternoon, Jackson had returned with news that Reverend Thompson had agreed to perform the ceremony on Saturday, just 3 days away. He also brought a simple gold band he had purchased from the jeweler in town. "It's not fancy," he apologized as he showed it to Daisy, "but it was the best they had on short notice. I can order something more elaborate from Denver once we're married if you'd prefer." "It's perfect," she assured him, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "I don't need anything elaborate." That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, a comfortable silence between them, Daisy felt a sense of peace she had never known before. Despite the lingering threat of her stepfather, despite the rushed nature of their wedding plans, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "What are you thinking?" Jackson asked, his voice quiet in the gathering dusk. "That I never expected to be this happy," she answered honestly. "That after my mother died, I thought my life would always be just enduring, surviving. I never imagined I could have this." He reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "I felt the same after Rebecca died, like happiness was something that happened to other people, not to me." He lifted her hand to his lips, placing a gentle kiss on her knuckles. "Thank you for proving me wrong." The next 2 days passed in a flurry of preparations. Mrs. Tucker, true to her word, brought the cream-colored silk and worked with Daisy to create a simple but elegant wedding dress. Johnson rode to the neighboring ranch to invite their closest neighbors to the ceremony, while Martinez traveled all the way to the next town to find flowers, which were scarce in Cottonwood Springs so late in the season. On the evening before the wedding, Daisy was in the kitchen finishing the preparations for the small celebration that would follow the ceremony when Jackson entered, his expression troubled. "What is it?" she asked immediately, recognizing the tension in his shoulders. "Has something happened?" "Johnson just got back from town with news," he said, closing the kitchen door behind him. "Russell's been seen in Cottonwood Springs. He returned this afternoon, apparently worse for wear and in a foul mood. He was asking questions about you at the saloon." Daisy's stomach clenched with fear. "Does he know about tomorrow?" "I don't think so. Johnson says he seemed more interested in finding out where you're staying than anything else." Jackson moved to the window, checking that the shutters were securely fastened. "I've asked the men to keep extra watch tonight just in case." "Should we postpone the wedding?" Daisy asked, though the thought pained her. "No," Jackson's voice was firm. "If anything, this makes it more urgent. Once we're married, his legal hold over you will be completely severed." He turned back to her, his expression softening. "Unless you want to wait." "No," she said quickly. "I want to be your wife, Jackson. Tomorrow can't come soon enough for me." He smiled then, the worry easing from his face. "Nor for me." He crossed the kitchen to her side, taking her hands in his. "One more night and then you'll be Mrs. Hayes. Try to get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." Daisy slept fitfully that night. A mixture of pre-wedding nerves and anxiety about Hank's return to town keeping her awake. When she finally drifted off near dawn, she dreamed of fire and smoke, of running through the darkness with Hank's voice calling after her. She woke with a start just as the first light was breaking through her window, her heart pounding. Forcing the unsettling dream from her mind, she rose and began preparing for the day. Mrs. Tucker arrived shortly after sunrise, bringing the completed wedding dress and a basket of fresh baking. "No bride should have to cook her own wedding breakfast," the older woman declared, shooing Daisy upstairs to bathe and dress. "Everything is taken care of. You just focus on making yourself beautiful for Mr. Hayes, though goodness knows he thinks you're perfect already." By mid-morning, the ranch yard had been transformed. Martinez and Johnson had strung ribbons between the porch posts and arranged benches in neat rows facing the house. The small group of guests, neighbors from surrounding ranches, Reverend Thompson and his wife, and the sheriff and his deputy began arriving around 11. Daisy watched from her bedroom window, her heart fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The cream and blue dress Mrs. Tucker had helped her create fit perfectly, the soft fabric flowing gracefully to her ankles. Her hair was arranged in a simple updo with a few wildflowers tucked into the golden strands. A knock at her door announced Mrs. Tucker, who entered with tears already forming in her eyes. "Oh, my dear. You look absolutely radiant." "Thank you for everything, Ethel," Daisy said, embracing the woman who had become like a mother to her in these past months. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Nonsense. You and Mr. Hayes found each other all on your own. I just helped with the details." Mrs. Tucker dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "It's nearly time. Are you ready?" Daisy took a deep breath and nodded. "More than ready." They made their way downstairs and to the back door of the house, where they would emerge onto the porch for the ceremony. Through the window, Daisy could see Jackson standing near the steps, looking handsome and somewhat nervous in his best black suit. Reverend Thompson stood beside him, Bible in hand, while the guests were seated facing the porch, just as Mrs. Tucker was about to open the door. The sound of approaching horses caught their attention. A lot of horses, moving fast. "That doesn't sound like late guests," Daisy said, a knot forming in her stomach. Mrs. Tucker peered through the window, her expression darkening. "It's not. It's your stepfather, and he's brought company." Daisy's heart sank as she moved to look outside. Sure enough, Hank Russell was leading a group of at least 6 men on horseback into the ranch yard, disrupting the neat rows of seated guests. He was unkempt and unshaven, his clothes dirty from the road, but the meanness in his eyes was all too familiar. "Where is she?" she heard him shout as he dismounted. "Where's my stepdaughter?" Jackson moved to intercept him, his posture tense but controlled. "Russell, this is private property and you're interrupting a wedding. I suggest you leave immediately." Hank laughed, an ugly sound that sent chills down Daisy's spine even from a distance. "A wedding, is it? How convenient. Trying to steal my property legally now, Hayes." "Miss Russell is not property," Jackson said evenly. "And she's made her choice clear. She doesn't want anything to do with you. That's not for her to decide." Hank's voice was slurred slightly. He'd been drinking, Daisy realized with growing dread. "She belongs at the saloon, working off what she owes me for raising her all these years." By now, Sheriff Thomas had risen from his seat and moved to stand beside Jackson. "That's enough, Russell. The lady is of age and free to marry whomever she chooses. You have no legal claim on her." "The hell I don't," Hank bellowed. "Her mother left her in my care. I'm the closest thing to family she's got." Daisy had heard enough. Despite Mrs. Tucker's attempts to hold her back, she pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch, her wedding dress catching the sunlight. "You were never family to me, Hank," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Family doesn't threaten. Family doesn't try to sell a person to the highest bidder. Family doesn't burn down a home out of spite." Hank's bloodshot eyes fixed on her, a mixture of rage and something almost like hurt crossing his face. "You ungrateful little after everything I did for you." "What exactly did you do for her, Russell?" Jackson's voice was dangerously quiet. "Beat her, threaten her, try to force her into prostitution." The gathered guests murmured in shock at this last accusation, many of the women clutching their hands to their mouths or whispering behind their fans. Hank's face reddened with anger. "That's a damned lie," he gestured wildly toward Daisy. "She's the one who ran off with you in the middle of the night. What does that make her if not a whore?" Before anyone could react, Jackson lunged forward and struck Hank squarely in the jaw. The larger man staggered back, surprised by the force of the blow. "Apologize to my bride," Jackson demanded, his hands still clenched into fists at his sides. Hank regained his balance and spat blood onto the ground. "Your bride? She's not yours yet, Hayes." With shocking speed for a man of his size, he drew a revolver from his belt and pointed it directly at Jackson. "And she never will be." Everything seemed to happen at once. Sheriff Thomas reached for his own weapon, the wedding guests scattered for cover, and Daisy screamed Jackson's name. One of Hank's companions, perhaps realizing that threatening a man in front of a sheriff was a bad idea, tried to grab Hank's arm. "Don't be a fool, Russell," he hissed. "You'll hang for sure." Hank shook him off, his gun still trained on Jackson. "Get out of my way. He's taken everything from me." Jackson stood his ground, unarmed but unafraid. "Put the gun down, Russell. This doesn't have to end badly." "The hell it doesn't," Hank snarled. His finger tightened on the trigger. What happened next would remain a blur in Daisy's memory for years to come. She saw the sheriff draw his weapon, heard the crack of a gunshot, and watched in horror as a spray of red bloomed across the front of Hank's shirt. But it wasn't Sheriff Thomas who had fired, it was one of Hank's own men, the same one who had tried to stop him moments before. "Damn it all, Russell," the man said as Hank crumpled to the ground, the unfired revolver falling from his limp hand. "I told you this revenge business would get you killed." Chaos erupted in the ranch yard. The sheriff and his deputy moved quickly to disarm and restrain Hank's associates, while Johnson ran to fetch the doctor who, fortunately, had been invited to the wedding. Daisy stood frozen on the porch, unable to fully process what she was seeing. Jackson rushed to her side, taking her hands in his. "Are you all right?" She nodded mutely, her eyes still fixed on the scene below where the doctor was now kneeling beside Hank's still form. "Is he?" She couldn't finish the question. "I don't know," Jackson said honestly. "The doctor's with him now." They watched in tense silence as the doctor examined Hank, then looked up grimly. "He's alive, but the bullet's lodged close to his heart. He needs to be moved somewhere I can operate, and even then." He shook his head, leaving the poor prognosis unspoken. The sheriff organized several men to carefully transport Hank to the ranch house, where the dining table was quickly cleared to serve as an operating surface. Daisy moved mechanically to assist the doctor, providing clean linens and hot water as needed. "You don't have to do this," Jackson told her softly as she prepared to bring more bandages to the makeshift surgery. "He's caused you nothing but pain." "I know," she said, "but I can't just stand by and do nothing while a man dies, even if that man is Hank." Jackson's expression softened with understanding and pride. "It's one of the many reasons I love you." For the next hour, the doctor worked to extract the bullet and stop the bleeding while the sheriff questioned the man who had shot Hank. It emerged that the shooter, a cattle broker named Donovan, had been drawn into Hank's rustling operation unwittingly and had grown increasingly concerned about Hank's obsession with vengeance against Daisy and Jackson. "He was out of control," Donovan explained to Sheriff Thomas. "Drinking more than usual, talking crazy about burning down the whole ranch with everyone inside. When I saw him pull that gun, I knew somebody was going to die. I figured better him than an innocent man on his wedding day." Eventually, the doctor emerged from the dining room, his shirt sleeves rolled up and blood staining his hands and apron. "I've done what I can," he reported tiredly. "The bullet's out, but he's lost a lot of blood. It's in God's hands now." "Can he be moved to town?" Sheriff Thomas asked. "The jail's not ideal, but no," Daisy interrupted. "He can stay here until he's stable enough to travel." She looked to Jackson. "If that's all right with you," Jackson hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course, we have the guest room upstairs." With the immediate crisis addressed, attention turned back to the interrupted wedding. Most of the guests had remained, though the festive atmosphere had understandably diminished. Reverend Thompson approached Jackson and Daisy where they stood on the porch. "Given the circumstances," he said gently, "perhaps you would prefer to postpone the ceremony." Daisy looked at Jackson, searching his face for his thoughts. What she found there was not hesitation but steadfast resolve. "No," Jackson said firmly. "If Daisy is willing, I'd like to proceed as planned. We've waited long enough." "I agree," Daisy said, squeezing his hand. "Today has only reinforced how precious life is and how important it is to seize happiness when we find it." And so, with Hank Russell unconscious in the guest room upstairs and the sheriff's deputy standing guard, Daisy Russell and Jackson Hayes were married on the front porch of their ranch house. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, the couple's vows carrying extra weight after the day's dramatic events. "I, Jackson, take you, Daisy, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Jackson's deep voice carried clearly to all assembled. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." Daisy repeated the vows with tears in her eyes, her voice steady and sure. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, and Jackson lowered his head to kiss her, the small gathering of guests erupted in applause. The celebration that followed was subdued but genuinely joyful. Mrs. Tucker served the wedding feast she had prepared, and neighbors offered heartfelt toasts to the newlyweds. As evening approached, the guests gradually departed, leaving the new Mr. and Mrs. Hayes alone with their unusual household situation. "Not exactly the wedding day we planned," Jackson said as they stood together on the porch, watching the last of the guests ride away. "I'm sorry it was marred by violence." "Don't apologize," Daisy said, leaning into his embrace. "We're married. That's all that matters to me." He kissed her temple, his arms tightening around her. "Indeed we are, Mrs. Hayes." The use of her new name sent a thrill through Daisy. "I like the sound of that, as do I." His voice deepened, and when she looked up at him, she saw desire darkening his eyes. "I think it's time we retired for the evening, don't you?" Before she could respond, the door opened behind them and the doctor emerged, looking weary. "Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Hayes, I'm sorry to interrupt, but your patient is awake. He's asking to speak with Daisy." Jackson's expression immediately hardened. "Absolutely not. After everything he's done, it's all right." Daisy placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I want to hear what he has to say." "Then I'm coming with you," Jackson said firmly. The doctor nodded. "That's probably wise. He's very weak, but still potentially dangerous. I wouldn't advise either of you to be alone with him." They followed the doctor upstairs to the guest room, where Hank Russell lay pale and drawn against the white pillows. The sheriff's deputy stood at attention near the window, watching the injured man closely. Hank's eyes, once so full of menace, now seemed sunken and dull. His gaze shifted to the doorway as they entered, fixing first on Daisy in her wedding dress, then on Jackson's protective stance beside her. "So you went through with it," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're his wife now." "Yes," Daisy confirmed, moving closer to the bed but still keeping Jackson's solid presence at her side. "What did you want to say to me, Hank?" He was silent for a long moment, his labored breathing the only sound in the room. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. "Your mother would have been proud." Daisy blinked, certain she had misheard. "What, Sarah?" "She would have been proud of you, standing up for yourself." He coughed weakly, wincing at the pain it caused. "I never was the husband she deserved, or the stepfather you needed." Jackson's hand found Daisy's, offering silent support as she struggled to process this unexpected moment of clarity from the man who had caused her so much suffering. "Why did you come after me?" she asked. "Why couldn't you just let me go?" Hank's gaze drifted to the ceiling. "Pride, I guess, and anger. You were the last thing I had of hers when you left." He trailed off, then added in a whisper, "I didn't know how to be alone." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was perhaps the closest thing to an explanation Daisy would ever receive from him. She felt a complex mixture of emotions: lingering anger, a hint of pity, and finally, a sense of closure. "I forgive you, Hank," she said quietly. "Not for your sake, but for mine. I won't carry the weight of hatred for you into my new life." Something almost like relief flickered across his haggard features. He nodded once, then closed his eyes, clearly exhausted by the brief conversation. The doctor moved forward. "He needs rest now. The next 24 hours will be critical." As they left the room, Jackson pulled Daisy into a gentle embrace. "You continue to amaze me," he murmured against her hair. "Most people in your position would wish him dead." "There's been enough hatred," she said simply. "I want our marriage to begin with love, not vengeance." He tilted her chin up and kissed her softly. "Then love it shall be from this day forward." That night, in the privacy of the master bedroom, Jackson and Daisy consummated their marriage with tenderness and passion. All the restraint of the past months dissolved as they finally allowed themselves to fully express the love that had grown between them. In Jackson's arms, Daisy found a joy she had never imagined possible, a belonging so complete it brought tears to her eyes. "I love you," she whispered as they lay entwined in the aftermath, the moonlight casting silver patterns across their skin. "I think I've loved you since that night in the alley when you said you'd die before letting him hurt me." Jackson brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "And I've loved you just as long, perhaps longer." He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, her lips. "Thank you for being brave enough to build a new life, for trusting me to be part of it." "Thank you for giving me the chance," she replied, nestling closer against his warmth. They drifted to sleep in each other's arms, the troubles of the past temporarily forgotten in the promise of their shared future. Hank Russell died shortly before dawn. Despite the doctor's best efforts, the internal bleeding couldn't be stopped. He passed quietly in his sleep, never regaining consciousness after his brief conversation with Daisy. The news brought a strange hollowness to what should have been the joyful first morning of their married life. Daisy stood by the window of their bedroom, watching as the sheriff's men prepared to transport Hank's body back to town. "Are you all right?" Jackson asked, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Yes, she said after a moment's reflection. Sad in a way I didn't expect to be, but also relieved. It's truly over now. He pressed a kiss to her shoulder. We can begin our life together without looking over our shoulders. The following weeks brought a gradual return to normalcy, though life at the Hayes Ranch was forever changed by the presence of a mistress where once there had been only a bachelor owner. Daisy took to her role as Jackson's wife with natural grace, managing the household with Mrs. Tucker's continued help, and bringing warmth to spaces that had once felt merely functional. As autumn deepened toward winter, they began making plans to rebuild the foreman's cabin, though with modifications to make it suitable for Johnson, who had expressed interest in bringing his wife and children to live on the property. The main house underwent subtle changes as well: curtains at the windows, wildflowers on the dining table, and most significantly, the gradual addition of a nursery adjoining the master bedroom. For Daisy had discovered, just before Christmas, that their family would be growing by spring. On a clear, cold evening in late December, she and Jackson sat together on the porch swing he had built for her birthday, bundled in blankets against the winter chill, watching the stars emerge in the vast Colorado sky. "Are you happy?" Jackson asked, his hand resting protectively over the slight swell of her abdomen. Daisy smiled, covering his hand with her own. "Completely. Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He pulled her closer against his side. "When I saw you that night in the saloon, I never imagined we would end up here. When you stepped between me and Hank in that alley, I knew you were different," she said, remembering. "You said he would touch me over your grave." Jackson chuckled softly. "I meant it too. Though I'm glad it didn't come to that, as am I." Daisy closed her eyes, savoring the security of his embrace, the peace they had found together. "I love you, Jackson Hayes, and I love you, Daisy Hayes, now and always." As snow began to fall gently around them, dusting the ranch in pristine white, they remained on the porch a while longer, talking quietly of the future, the child that would arrive in the spring, the improvements they planned for the ranch, the life they would build together, day by day. A life born from a moment of courage in a dusty alley, when a cowboy stepped forward and changed both their destinies forever.